Hello, welcome to the SMU Video Archive series. In the series, we interview members of the SMU community who can provide insight into the history of SMU, especially from the perspective of their time at the university. I'm Jim Early, and today we have with us Marian Tate, wife of former SMU President Willis M. Tate. Marian, your time in the university was rather extended from the time you arrived as a very precocious 15-year-old freshman until the present time. So perhaps we might start out with your sense of SMU when you first arrived, and then we can move along.
Well, I did. I came here in the summer right after graduating from Highland Park High School, and graduated in 3 years with a Bachelor of Arts degree in English and Spanish and a minor in psychology. And at the same time, I was a special piano pupil of Dr. Paul Van Katwick, who at that time was the Dean of the School of Music. I had been studying with him for several years before I came to SMU and continued while I was here. And it was an unusual time at SMU. We had trimesters, and because it was the war years, no one had any gasoline or cars or tires, so everybody came and stayed on campus all day and went to school. And that's why we got through as quickly as we did. And it was a very unusual time here at SMU. The Navy had a V-12 program here. There was a Navy unit in school here in uniform. And it was a very different time, certainly from what it is now.
Then you married a SMU student?
Yes, I married my SMU sweetheart as soon as I graduated, Dr. Tom Cleary, and he was here in the Navy program and then went on to Baylor Dental School. And so we were married for 37 years. It was a happy marriage.
Perhaps you might tell us the rather striking circumstance under which you returned to SMU.
Yes, I was working for the president of a large construction company here in Dallas, and the offices were quite a long way from where we lived. And I was sitting here in my office one day, and I thought I would just love to work at SMU. It's a wonderful place, and it's close to home. So I sat down and wrote a letter to President Willis Tate and asked him, told him that if he ever had an opening in the president's office to let me know, because that's where I'd like to work. That very day, his secretary retired. And he called me on a Saturday morning, said, would you come and talk to me? And I did, and he said, well, could you start on Monday? And I said, well, I think I would have to give my former employer a little notice, which I did, but 2 weeks later I was working here at SMU, and that's where I was for almost 17 or 18 years in the president's office.
And that was in the rather striking year of 1960.
Yes,
the
in 1960.
presidential election year.
Yes, and the 60s turned out to be a rather unusual time at the university too. And,
Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the arrangements on the second floor, some of the people who worked with Willis.
We had a wonderful group that we worked with. Sterling Wheeler was the vice president, Dr. Hosford was the provost, and Trent Root was vice president and treasurer. Hastings Harrison was an executive assistant to the president and was just wonderful at fundraising. That was his job. And Keith Baker came in a little later as vice president for development. And we really just, and Phoebe Davis was the secretary of the university. We just had a wonderful group on the second floor. We were all good friends and worked together all those years. There were very few changes.
Could you tell us a little bit about two of the rather notable women in that group, Phoebe Davis and also Johnny Marie Grimes, who helped Willis with his speeches?
Yes, Johnny Marie was just wonderful. She did all the research that it took to do his speeches and helped prepare most of them. Willis made so many speeches. There were some years when he made 200 to 300 speeches a year, and that's a lot of preparation to get that many speeches together. And of course, Phoebe had been here as a student also. I'm not sure which year she graduated, but she absolutely ran the Board of Trustees behind the scenes, organized all the board meetings, and was just a wonderful person to work with. And of course, later Neil McFarland became provost and was with our group after Dr. Hosford retired. And it just was an unusually happy time. We had a good time, and we all worked very hard. And but Willis was very pleasant to work with. He had an open door policy, and there was never any problem get to see him.
Could I shift gears momentarily, Marian, and ask you to talk a little bit about your sense of Willis and his relation to the Dallas community at that time?
He was quite active in so many things in Dallas. He was a member of the Dallas Citizens Council. He was very close to all of the leadership in Dallas. At that time, the banks were Dallas banks, and he was good friends with Fred Florence and all the others that were so prominent in banking during those days. He was very active in the YMCA. His father had been a YMCA general secretary. He was always close to the work with the Y and did a lot of that. And of course, he represented SMU and all of the various factions in the city. He was, when they built Medical City Hospital, he asked him to be the first chairman of the Board of Trustees of that hospital. At the same time, he was on the Board of Trustees of Baylor Dental School. I was always very active, of course, in all of the church activities, and particularly with Highland Park United Methodist Church. He was a member of their administrative board, and he was a delegate to General Conference and the Jurisdictional Conference and the World Methodist Council and all of those things. And but particularly in Dallas, there was just scarcely anything that ever happened that he wasn't there and representing the university.
Let me touch on another side of Dallas in those days, the kinds of pressure there were from conservative, if not virtually crazy quarters in terms of pressure. I remember you mentioned that religion course, which is perhaps one of the mildest issues.
Yes, there were some of my friends who were not allowed to attend SMU's parents wouldn't let them come to SMU because they had to take that religion course. I don't know exactly what the parents thought that religion course was going to do to them, but that was a requirement to graduate at that time. And Willis, of course, always was the champion of academic freedom, and that was his big thing. He received the Alexander Michael John Award for academic freedom, and I think he was most pleased because it was his faculty, who recommended him for the award, and that meant more to him than just about anything.
Well, I remember tales of his defending people like the relatively mild liberal Paul Bowler from various kinds of pressure.
Yes, and
not ever letting Paul know he was under fire.
That's right. And of course he went along with having Martin Luther King speak on the campus, and at that time that was a very, very controversial thing.
Could you tell us a
little? The downtown community didn't want that at all.
So there really was pressure on Willis not to allow it to happen.
Yes, because the student group invited Martin Luther King, but he stood behind them, and it was a very tense day here on the campus. They had a lot of security around, and everybody was quite concerned about how it was going to turn out. And turned out he preached a perfectly wonderful, kind, and loving sermon in McFarland Auditorium, and everybody went away very happy about the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, I remember being there, and the place seemed absolutely packed as far as I can remember.
It was, and it just upset the Dallas downtown community at that time very much, to think that we would allow him. And in fact, a lot of people now don't even know that Martin Luther King did speak here. They're surprised to find it out. So, that was another one of those times.
We were very close to Dallas, both for good and for pressure situations.
That's right.
At least.
That's right. Dallas has always been very supportive of SMU when they used to call the annual fund drive, the sustentation drive. Everybody backed SMU very well and worked hard on it.
Dallas had an almost unique, or SMU had a rather unique relation to the community of Dallas. I can't think of any other private university that has quite that close a relationship as we had then. All this has changed
Absolutely.
somewhat over the years.
Yes, it lost some of that for a few years. I think it's certainly, Gerald Turner has certainly brought it back into that relationship, I think, quite well.
Yeah. Let me ask about one rather celebrated episode in the 60s, the student takeover of the president's office.
Well, we were so fortunate here at SMU not to have had anywhere near the problems that some of the other universities had, particularly the bigger state schools. But there was a small group of organized BLAACS, and they spelled that BLAACS, their organization, who decided that they should take over the administration building and occupy the president's office. And they did, and the president met with them in his office and accepted their list of demands, and then left them there to think about it and meet just among themselves in his office, and he left. And after a few hours, they had talked their plans over and decided really what they wanted the university to do. They wanted a black house. They wanted, there were not very many of them. It's a very small group, and their spokesperson was one of the football players, a very fine young man named Rufus Cormier. And he had a very good head on his shoulders, and we did not have any real disruption, certainly not any violence. And it turned out that we were able to agree with them on quite a number of the things that they wanted done.
Well, I remember that in those days the black students felt very defensive and met by themselves in the student center. They didn't feel terribly comfortable. All this has changed so much for the better over the decades. But initially they felt a very small group and needed support of each other.
They did, and the first time they brought their list of demands, they came late in the afternoon after regular business hours, and I happened to be there working late that afternoon, and in fact I was the only person in the building when they came, and they were very belligerent at that point. They really, where is the president? We want to see him right now, and he wasn't there. But I took the list from them and agreed to give it to him, which I did. But it was a little bit tense then. In fact, the day that the building was occupied, I was the one that was answering the telephones, and we had a call from the governor's office wanting to know if we wanted the National Guard. And I said I didn't think so. I thought the University Park Police could probably handle the situation. But it was amazing, the news that got out. People were standing all around the outside of the building, wondering if we were all going to be safe. And it was the ones in the office got hungry, and so they let a rope down from the window of the president's office, and they sent some food up that way to them. So the only damage that was done to the president's office was a lot of paper napkins and mustard left over from hamburgers. Otherwise, we were very safe.
Mary, let me move forward to another matter. The Paul Hardin affair, one of the major crises in my time at SMU, the other perhaps being the athletic scandal in the late 80s. And I don't suspect you want to talk too much about it, but I think people would appreciate anything you'd care to say. And then the other thing is to touch on Willis's stepping into the breach, and maybe this is to overstate it a little bit, saving the university at a time that people were pretty agitated one way or another.
Willis had finally decided that he really would like to share the administration with a new president, and he would become chancellor. And the search committee spent a long time looking for the right person, and they found Paul Hardin. He's very young and very well positioned for the job, and he was brought in, and he moved into the president's office, and we moved down where the provost is right now, was where the chancellor's office was, and Willis was really ready to turn it over to him, but he felt like he needed to have a year or two in that particular arrangement in order to be ready to take over without any other top administrator. But Paul Hardin was a very ambitious person, and he didn't want to wait and learn. He wanted it right now, and he did step on a lot of toes, and he finally came to a conclusion that he would just quit. He said, if it's not going to work out, I just quit. He turned in his resignation, and it was accepted. And that was the end of Paul Hardin. He went on to become president of Drew University and then on to North Carolina, and has had a very fine career. He was a wonderful person, and it was unfortunate that it didn't work out here for him. But so Willis, in the meantime, had gone down to our condominium in Puerto Vallarta and was lying on the beach just letting the world go by, and he received a message that Mr. Ed Cox's plane was on the way to pick him up, and would he please come back? He was now president again, which was a rather exciting time. So we came back and into that situation. So we moved back down the hall again, back to the president's office, and he kept the title of president and chancellor until the search committee got together again and started looking for another president. And it was a rocky time. There were a lot of factions in the university that there were those who supported Paul Hardin, there were the ones that didn't, and the ones that didn't like what the Board of Trustees was doing, and the ones that did. And Willis was in a very, very difficult spot, and I think he handled it as well as anyone because he was so willing to listen. He would listen to everybody and anybody, and try not to be judgmental about it. And it took it took a lot out of him at that time to come back into that situation.
Once you feel you got it off your back,
And then it is all back again. And they had changed staff in the meantime, and here we are back again, here I am again. So it was a difficult time.
Well, I think that was one of Willis's great moments to come back.
And I think he really did pull the university back together again, and as well as anyone ever could have under the circumstances. And it was a very interesting time, to say the least. Maybe a little more interesting than we wanted it to be.
Well, I wonder if I've asked you most of the things I had in mind that might be useful to cover, but I wondered if you'd be willing to kind of give us a general sense of SMU from 1945 to 2000.
Oh my, that's a long period of time. Of course, there have been so many changes. The student body has grown so much larger, and of course, the athletic situation has changed a great deal. There was, the year that as Jerry Levias was recruited as the first black football player was really an extraordinary thing to happen. And now, of course, there's nothing at all to think of having the black athletes or just athletes. You don't think of them as either black or not black. And there have been so many changes in the growth of the university and in the different schools. The law school and of course the Meadows School has just grown by leaps and bounds, and the business school, now considered I think one of the top ones in the country. It's been this explosion of the faculty and bringing in so many new deans. There have just been so many changes here in the building of this beautiful new football stadium.
That was another thing we didn't touch on, the whole building during Willis's time.
Well, of course, nearly all of the buildings, up until these last few years were built during his administration. And we experienced the fire in Humphrey Lee Student Center during that time, and that all had to be rebuilt again. We went through the remodeling of Perkins Administration Building, where we had to move over to the 4th floor of the library and camp out for a while, which was also a different time for us. But I think it's just grown so much that there's so many more faculty, many more staff people. It's just grown to be such much larger university than it was. I think right now this explosion of building again is tremendous. Probably the largest since Willis.
Yes, I think in some ways Gerald seems Willis back again with difference, but once again construction.
He has told me that President Turner told me that the nicest compliment he'd been paid since he came here was that people told him that he reminded them of a young Willis Tate. And I said, well, I think that's about the nicest thing anybody could say about you. Because Willis was very much loved. And he worked very hard for causes that he really believed in, and strengthening the faculty and bringing in good leadership in the deans. And he really, he gave his life to this university. Of course, he was never happier than he was with students. He was a professor of sociology and taught that marriage and the family class, and it didn't make any difference where we were in the world, any airport we were going into, somebody would come running along, Dr. Tate, stop, stop, stop. I was in your sociology class, and we've been married 25 years, you know. He's always so glad to hear the ones that were still married. And he loved teaching, he really did. And it got to the point where he couldn't quite do it and handle the presidency too, but he really loved it. He was a good teacher.
Marian, would return to you again at the end, perhaps a sense of what you're doing these days.
Well, after I left working at SMU, I did a few other things. Among others, I married Willis Tate, which was something else too. But here, Gerald Turner has asked me to do a number of things here now, and I'm glad to do whatever I can. I'm on the board of directors of the Tate Lecture Series, and the Willis Tate Lecture Series, I think, would mean more to Willis if he could have known that they named him for him. It's simply wonderful. It's now considered the #1 lecture series in the United States. Supports the President's Scholars, which are some of the finest students we have at SMU. And I'm very proud to be on that board and find it a very wonderful experience, not only to be with the other members of the board, but the opportunity to meet in person all of these speakers that come here. It's just an extraordinary event in my life. And I'm doing that, and then I don't really know how I got on this benefits council, but all here of a sudden I found out I'm representing the retired staff people on the benefits council, which is another interesting thing to do. And I'm on the board of the faculty club, and I attend the Women's Financial Series at the Cox Business School, which is really something unusual. There's not another business school in the United States that has this women's organization. There are 100 of us who come through the school year every other Thursday. And it's taught by Dr. Don Jackson, who's a former professor here now, and came back to teach this course. And we keep up to date on what's going on in the investment world and with banking and all the other financial interests, and we find it very, very useful and educational, and that's something I enjoy very much. And so I find myself on campus again,
Yes.
often and happily. I have recently been cataloging Willis's books that I'm giving to the Dedman College Library. And I've already given the DeGolyer Library all of his speeches and personal papers. So I think that will help preserve that part of
Terribly
his,
good to build up the archive.
the archives, and know that those things will be taken care of for the years for anyone who is interested in using them for research. I think on down the line someone will do, maybe through these interviews, a very good history, another history. There have been several done, but pick up where they left off and go on.
It's kind of essentially come to Willis's time, and we need to go on.
In fact, I was very much surprised to learn that when I was taking these speeches over to DeGolyer that there are no copies of any speeches from any of the other SMU presidents. And that's too bad. That would have been nice to have preserved some of that.
Yes, indeed.
So it is. Willis just had so many facets to his life. Of course, I think being very close to the church was a big part of his life. Bill Dickinson, who was pastor at Highland Park for many years, was his best friend. And he always led a very serious and very dedicated prayer life, which I think is one of the things that made him who he was. So I don't know what else you might like to talk about, but that's about. I could talk about Willis as a husband, but I don't think that's what this is intended to do. He's a very fine husband. No.
Well, thank you very much, Marian. I think you've been immensely helpful to build up our record of things that you had a ringside seat at.
Well, they were exciting years, and it was a privilege to have been here during them, and I've enjoyed being with you.